The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, my name is Jenny Cover. I'm a board member of AXIS. I'm pleased to introduce our presenter this evening, who's Lawrence Dubin. Mr. Dubin is a professor of law at the University of Detroit Mercy Law School. He's authored books on legal ethics, evidence, and trial practice, and he's a frequent invited guest on radio and TV programs. Of interest to the AXIS community is that Mr. Dubin is also the author of a recently published book, Caught in the Web of the Criminal Justice System, which deals with the plight of the developmentally disabled who encounter the criminal justice system. Mr. Dubin has both personal and professional experience with this issue. He's the father of an accomplished young man on the autism spectrum who became involved in the criminal justice system over the use of his computer. Although this young man does not have a sex chromosome variation, we know that there's considerable overlap between sex chromosome aneuploidy and ASD, with a number of young people sharing both diagnoses or a substantial number of the behavioral elements. I know from answering the helpline over the years that the number of our young people with extra X and Y chromosomes have gotten themselves into difficulty using their computers to, for instance, view pornography and engage in chat rooms, often not understanding laws that forbid downloading photos of children or engaging in internet sexual contact with underage persons or police officers who are pretending to be minors. Mr. Dubin experienced the trauma of having his adult son charged with one of these crimes. He's here to speak about the difficulties that young adults with emotional and social challenges have in understanding safe use of the internet and being treated appropriately by the criminal justice system if they do run afoul of the law. We have a large audience today, so we can't keep the phone lines open. All of the attendees are on mute. So please ask your questions using the GoToWebinar dialog screen on your computer on the right-hand side. If you've dialed in rather than being on the computer, you can send the questions to me at info@genetic.org. That's info@genetic.org. At the end of the presentation, I'll read questions and we'll have time, the questions that we have time for, and Mr. Dubin will respond. Also, I want all of the viewers to know that AXIS posts our webinars on the genetic.org website in the next few weeks. And now, Mr. Dubin.
Well, good evening to all of you, and it's a pleasure to be speaking with you this evening, and I look forward to any questions that are presented after I make my comments. As you can see from the title of my presentation, I will be talking about essentially three different but interrelated subjects. One is developmental disabilities, and I'll talk a bit about, in a general sense, the importance of a syndrome or condition being viewed as a developmental disability. I'm also going to take on a subject which is rarely discussed, and that is the subject of sexuality, and especially sexuality as it involves people with developmental disabilities and the law. So I should say right at the outset that I do not consider myself, by way of learning, an expert in developmental disabilities. I've learned a lot. I've done a lot of research. I've lived through experiences as a result of my son, but it is not a part of my degree learning. Same thing is true of sexuality. I grew up, as all of us have, in learning about sexuality in ways other than in a classroom, and the law. Now, when it comes to the law, at least my areas of the law, which I will discuss, that is something that I have studied and have been involved in that particular profession for over 50 years. I speak as a parent of a child with a developmental disability and also as a lawyer and a law professor. So moving along, I want to talk a bit about the concept of justice. And I bring that up because there's a lot of different motives that people have for going to law school. I went to law school back in the mid 1960s, and I attended the University of Michigan Law School. Also at the University of Michigan as an undergraduate. I majored in economics, but then decided to go to law school. And one of the reasons that I may not have totally understood, but have come to see as a reason not only for me going to law school, but a lot of others, is motivation and kind of an involvement in this mystery of the concept of justice. But recognizing that when it comes to the legal profession, it is the only profession that deals directly with this subject of justice and what does it mean. And I remember prior to going to law school and growing up, reading To Kill a Mockingbird and reading about this fictional character, Atticus Finch, who was a lawyer in the South who represented a black man charged with a crime who was innocent, but the crime and the trial took place during a period of tremendous hatred toward black people. And this attorney, Atticus Finch, was brave enough to care about justice in representing this individual and ultimately getting a just result. And I felt when I finished that book, a certain experience of joy in seeing justice being achieved. And I think that in part, and probably at a very unconscious level, that was motivation for me to want to go into law. So there certainly was a certain amount of idealism that I brought to the study. I have to say, being in law school is not always an experience of idealism, but that's at least what brought me in the door. In the process of my professional life, I did practice law for almost a decade, and then I went into teaching. I joined the law faculty at the University of Detroit Mercy School of Law. And part of my professional work, in addition to writing books and articles, has been as an independent producer for public television. And I found, again, without even making the connection to why I went to law school, gravitating toward people who fought for justice. So I made a program where I profiled Fred Gray and got to meet him. Fred Gray became a legal hero of mine. He had represented Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks. And in the process, I was able to meet Rosa Parks and interview her in my home. I made a documentary regarding Virgil Hawkins, who was an African-American who brought litigation and helped desegregate the University of Florida. He was represented by Thurgood Marshall, and my program was narrated, if any of you remember, the late Representative Barbara Jordan, who had a spectacular voice in reading my script for that documentary. So that and this notion of the arc of the moral universe, which, as Dr. Martin Luther King said, is long, but it bends toward justice. And I always think of Dr. King, especially at a time of an anniversary of his birth or his death, in the patience that he had for justice to occur. He was not someone who demanded justice immediately. After all, slavery started in the 1600s, and he was talking about the arc, this moral arc, and his optimism that it would bend toward justice back in the 1960s, and reference is still made to that today. So it also makes me realize that injustice can occur within a very short period of time, but this arc of justice may be over a very long period of time, if at all. I think there's a certain hope that we all have to see justice prevail. Now, you can see in this next frame that my son, when I was interviewing Rosa Parks, I went where he was and I brought him home so he could meet her. And he also had the occasion to meet Muhammad Ali. So those two pictures together because those are two individuals who did utilize the legal system to accomplish, I think, what some could refer to as social justice in certainly different causes. Now, I'd like to talk a bit about what is a developmental disability. To me, it's pretty obvious, as it is to probably all of you, but I was surprised that when I was discussing, and my son's lawyers were discussing his case, they didn't really understand the difference between a developmental disability and a mental illness. Whether that should be a legitimate concern of theirs or not is another question, but what is the difference? And I think we know that with a developmental disability, whether it is neurologically based, as is true with autism, or genetically based, as we see with the X and Y variations, a developmental disability occurs at birth. And what's significant about that, particularly with probably a majority of crimes that bring people with developmental disabilities into the criminal justice system, is that there is some correlation. And the correlation often is that the crime will be dealing with what will be referred to as a sex crime or a sex-related crime. Crime doesn't have to involve even actual contact, but physical contact, but it might. And a developmental disability means that that disability occurred at the time of birth and therefore impacted someone through all of the different areas of their development. And that would include their social and sexual development. Whereas with a mental illness, a person may go through those normal stages of development through adolescence into adulthood without any mental illness arising, and it could occur later on in life, so that their social sexual development was not impaired as it would be with a developmental disability. So it does become important, I think, when I'm talking about the interplay with a person with a developmental disability who is charged with an offense, and that offense does relate to problems that arose during the early stages of development through adolescence, and those stages were impacted by that disability. So examples of the developmental disability, I'm most familiar with certainly autism and what used to be referred to as Asperger's. Now, in the last number of years, people with Asperger's are viewed as being on the autism spectrum, although the term is still used by some who were previously diagnosed as Asperger's. Today, I think it's seen more as high-functioning autism. X and Y variations, intellectual disability, fetal alcohol syndrome, and there are a few other disabilities that would come within the purview of being deemed a developmental disability, as I've discussed. So I'd like to, because my knowledge is closer to an understanding of the neurological characteristics of Asperger's or high-functioning autism, some of these characteristics probably are true for some people with X and Y variations. Perhaps there may be other characteristics for other disabilities, but let me at least give you a sense of what these characteristics would be for high-functioning autism. There is what is referred to as theory of mind deficit or mind blindness. And again, these are all as a result of the neurological basis, the neurological origin of autism from birth. But this is the explanation of how that neurology plays out in the individual's disability. So theory of mind deficit is where the person is turned into their inner world, and internally the focus is limited to the outer world and becomes much more inner. So we think of the child who's spinning a top and doesn't see anything else that is happening in the environment other than the top spinning. That would certainly not be someone necessarily with high functioning autism, but it could be someone who is on the spectrum. So it's referred to as mind blindness. I think that most people with Asperger's would say that there is empathy. It's not a question of them lacking empathy, but neurologically they turn into their own inner needs and their own view of the world. Central coherence deficit is where the person cannot tell the forest from the trees. They don't see the whole picture. They see that which interests them. Executive functioning deficit has to do with multitasking. Again, it's very difficult for someone to multitask when you're zeroing in on a particular matter in front of you, and not seeing everything. This creates social difficulties for people with autism, and this stems from during the psychosexual development during adolescence, and even the social development in earlier stages of development, the difficulty that is experienced as a result of some of these deficits. It causes young people, as they are growing up, to not enjoy the social contact that people would without autism. They tend, because of this desire to turn to their inner world, to develop, therefore, special interests and repetitive behavior. Special interests may be only special to them and be of no interest to anyone else, or in fact, they may be interests that are the basis for what might become future employment. And I'll get into some examples of this when I talk about my son. They like to have clear rules because the clear rules provide guidelines for appropriate behavior. They understand at a level that they're different than other people, that there are issues that they deal with that they can tell other people don't. And in that process, they want to know what are the rules, what are the guidelines, and they tend to be law followers, not law breakers. If anything, they tend to not be people who hurt others. If anything, they tend to be people who are hurt by others, as a general proposition. So because of their limited desire for social activity, they tend to, those who are sufficiently high functioning, tend to enjoy using computers because they can use a computer by themselves for the purpose of acquiring information without the need for social intervention. They can learn about all kinds of things, and they can develop and learn about their special interests, things that interested them. Could be dinosaurs. One of the things I'll mention prematurely that my son was interested in it at a very young age. And I didn't even understand the relation to Asperger's because Asperger's wasn't even a diagnosis at that point. But he had this tremendous gift for directions and highways. And it was as if a GPS was kind of built into his brain. I would never get lost as long as I was with him because he would always have a sense of directions and where to go. So they are often people who are naive, subject to being bullied and being taken advantage of, which can also be a basis for further problems down the road that can lead them into the criminal justice system. Now, in terms of developmentally disabled people, I want to discuss This is a subject that is not always an easy subject to discuss, even with people who are not developmentally disabled. I am not developmentally disabled, and I don't remember my parents ever sitting down with me and openly discussing sexual issues in a way that I would say was at an intellectual level for it to have been of value. Same thing was true with education in schools. And I think in general, we can see that as a society, we are not exactly in great shape when it comes to our society's view of human sexuality. We have groups fighting as to whether it should be in school as a subject or shouldn't be in school. We can turn on television and see issues of a highly sexualized nature, and we can see within the political life sharp divisions of views on the issues of sexuality. So I like this quote by the editor of National Lawyers Guild that goes to kind of that confusion, where he says it should go without saying that human sexuality is rife with complexity and mystifying contradictions. Yet our criminal laws and procedures regarding sex crimes respond to the swirling welter of incomprehensible impulses with stubborn and self-defeating simplicity. We punish that which we fear to understand. And I think that basically is true to my experience that I will talk about in a bit. Also, a psychologist, Natalie Goujon, who is a Canadian and wrote a article on sexuality of people with autism and certain other groups with developmental disabilities, specifically developed this notion that people with Asperger's and people on the autism spectrum are sexual beings who have difficulty in their sexual development due to this disability. When I read that, actually after my son had I think was into his 30s, to some extent surprised me, because I have to say that there are so many issues that a parent deals with when a child on with a developmental disability is growing up that put sexuality on the back burner and does not really create any kind of alarm system for its importance. So what I want to bring out, and which I will discuss later on, is the importance of recognizing the children with developmental disabilities as sexual beings. And once we recognize it, then the big challenge is, now what do we do about it? How do we deal with that? It's important to deal with it. It's not an easy challenge, but it's important that we acknowledge that challenge. Now, I'd like to talk about the notion of being a parent with a child on the autism spectrum or with a developmental disability. I came across a quote from Andrew Solomon's book. This was a wonderful book called Far from the Tree. And the quote is, "If you have a child with a disability, you are forever the parent of a disabled child. It is one of the primary facts about you, fundamental to the way other people perceive you." There's almost a special bond that I have found with other parents who have a child with a developmental disability, in that the need to protect that child is much greater than it would be for parents of a child who would not have a developmental disability. Protecting the child from bullies at school, from teachers who don't understand the child, either for purposes of educational objectives or in the sense of one teacher. I remember my son, who had fine motor deficits. He had an art teacher who would ridicule him by holding up his artwork so that the class could laugh at him Now, she didn't realize he had a developmental disability, but it was a humiliating experience that caused me to had to go to school and have a personal conversation with this teacher to protect my child from this teacher who had bullying tendencies. Parents lose control of protecting a child with a disability when that child comes within the criminal justice system. And that's one of the most painful aspects of that happening. You're so geared to and able on notice to protect that child in so many ways based upon the normal development that the child had with those issues. And now it is taken away from you with people who could care less. And it really is a cruel experience to have to go through, and one that I would hope perhaps at least my discussion tonight will help all of you try your best to avoid. I want to give you a sense of my family story, because this is where I gained a lot of my expertise about the subject matter that I'm speaking about. Prior to this family experience that I'm going to discuss, as a lawyer, I was a trial lawyer. I did do some criminal defense work, but as a law professor, my main areas of research and teaching were legal ethics, how lawyers should properly behave, including defense lawyers and including prosecutors. I want to just back up a little bit and give you the history that I met my wife, Kitty, at the University of Michigan when I was in law school. We married about 4 years after that, and we waited probably about 7 or 8 years before we had my only son. And we did that because we wanted to get started in our careers, and I think saw that having a child was going to be a big responsibility, and thought it would be easier on us and make us better parents if we got our careers jump started. About my son, when he was probably around 1 year old and he started to walk, I noticed that he would do a lot of jumping. I thought it was kind of cute. This goes back into the late 1970s, so autism and Asperger's was not a subject even to be thought of. No one suggested that there was a neurological origin for that, but there was jumping and flapping. At age 3, we had some concern, a lot of concern. He did not have any speech, which is referred to as aphasia, and he lacked comprehension, which is referred to as echolalia, where you simply repeat that which you hear. In addition, he had gross and fine motor deficits. So needless to say, he had a lot of catching up to do, which is basically what people told us. Boys progress at a slower pace, and they oftentimes catch up. He was put into a special program through public school, and it was a class of 2 or 3 kids, and they generally didn't play with one another. But the teachers suggested that he get speech therapy. He did, and speech came in very rapidly, and all of a sudden what had been his weakness of no speech became his strength of being very verbal. This kind of became part of his story in life, that what seemed to be a deficit ultimately could become a strength, but there were certain deficits that still remained. He did seem to have special interests. As a young child, he loved music. He had this knowledge of highways. He knew every interstate, I think from the East Coast to the West Coast. At school, he had a difficult time because of social issues. He tended to be by himself. Teachers would certainly make us known of that fact. I wanted to try to get him involved in sports. He did not seem to have any great inclination to be involved, but he did swim a little bit. He did play a little basketball. Was not that good and didn't, I think, enjoy those endeavors because he was not that good at it. But I gave him a tennis lesson, and lo and behold, he started playing pretty well. And his tennis instructors would say, I think Nick has some talent in this. And again, for someone with gross and fine motor deficits, all of a sudden, he's playing #1 singles at a very competitive high school. He's becoming ranked among 6 states as one of the best tennis players. He's getting written up in the newspapers. And he's kind of an anomaly because he's not tall. He doesn't really work out that much. He loves to play tennis. But what I realize now why he was so good, it was a special interest. And he was able to watch every videotape of every major tennis tournament match, the U.S. Open and the French Open, Australian Open, all of the Wimbledon, all of these matches of all of the great tennis players over and over again. And in his mind, he became privy to an encyclopedia of shots. So that, coupled with his love of tennis and his love of playing tennis, really created this somewhat surprising development of him becoming this tremendous athlete in tennis. In terms of education, it was always difficult. He was in special ed. He hated being in special ed. He hated feeling that he was different from other kids. He rebelled a bit against it. I think the subjects in school, for the most part, tended to not interest him. So again, at this point, he did not have a diagnosis. We viewed everything as a psychological issue. Oh, if he, his teachers would say, if only he tried harder. His therapists would view it as a psychological issue and not have the benefit of understanding that some of this had a neurological basis. So from high school, he did decide that he wanted to go away to college because most of the colleagues of his in high school were going away. He went to a very good high school, very competitive academic high school, and most were going to top-notch schools. He was not a top-notch student, but he did have his tennis skills, and there was a university in Michigan that was interested in him as a tennis player and had good academic resources. So he decided to go to Grand Valley State, which is in Grand Rapids, right off of Grand Rapids in Western Michigan. And he was in a dorm that was supposed to be the best dorm for him. We just described, although as I said, his diagnosis had not happened, we described issues that he had, and they put him in the dorm that they thought would be the most conducive to him. After 2 weeks, he called me and he said, I'm coming home. It's too noisy in here. It's too social. There's loud music. I can't think. My roommate comes in at 3 in the morning, and instead of him coming home, because I saw that as psychologically being a situation that would cause him to feel like a failure, I was able to move him out of the dorm into the basement of a home where he could have quiet and privacy and be able to try to get through the first year of college. And I told him as a, I suppose I could use the word bribe, that if he gets through the first year, I would help him live to enjoy one of his special interests. One of the special interests that I have not mentioned so far when he was growing up as a young child was television shows involving game shows. He loved game shows. He could listen to The Price is Right. He could listen to any of those game shows that had a lot of noise and bells going off, and he'd be jumping up and down and loving them, and would write for the pictures of the MC. So his favorite was The Price is Right. And I said to him, if you get through your first year of school, we'll go to Los Angeles and we'll go see The Price is Right. And he did get through the first year, and we did go to Los Angeles, and we went to The Price is Right. He thought he was going to get on. I said to him, Nick, everyone that goes there thinks they're going to get on. They all want to get on. And don't get your hopes up. We got into the studio. The first name that was called was for Nick to come on down. He became a contestant on the show. Bob Barker, you could see, really enjoyed him. He won $6,000, and we had a wonderful time. I have a lot of relatives in Los Angeles too, and some friends, so it turned out to be a wonderful, successful trip for him. His second year, he decided to go back to a local college near Detroit, Oakland University, where my wife teaches in the theater department. She is a playwright, and he got his degree from Oakland University. He used his $6,000 to buy jazz records, which became a special interest, and he used that to get his own jazz show because you needed a music format that you could not hear on normal commercial radio, and he enjoyed having that radio show. From there, he decided that instead of being a disc jockey or being in communications, he would go into education and get a degree in special ed so he could help children in a way that he felt would be perhaps better than the way he was helped by his special ed teachers. He went into a 4-year degree program at the University of Detroit where he needed both a special ed degree and an education degree. He did very well academically in his 4th year during when he went into the classroom to be the assistant to the teacher. After 2 or 3 weeks, he absolutely could not function with 32 children and agreed with the principal of the school and the teacher that this was not the right fit for him. Left that, but did get a degree in special ed. He didn't get licensed as a teacher. And after a couple of months of feeling very depressed in not meeting that objective and still not really understanding himself, he decided that he would apply for a program, a doctorate program in psychology. And he was accepted to that program, but had to take some psychology classes to make up for the lack of them in his undergraduate work. And one course was in abnormal psychology, where he came across the subject of Asperger's, came home to my wife and I and said, I now understand what difficulties I have had throughout my life. I have had Asperger's. And my wife and I saw that this was autism, a type of autism. We clearly did not see it. It had never been raised by any expert who had seen my son, who at this point was a very articulate person and presented himself well, still had lots of social issues in growing up. But he wanted to be, he wanted to see someone, so we went to a neurologist who did extensive testing and did arrive at the diagnosis of Asperger's. He let that be known to this school, for the doctorate, and they welcomed him, and they said instead of having to go through 2,000 hours of psychotherapy work with patients, you can spend the 2,000 hours in different universities or clinics, social agencies that deal with people with autism, and become the expert in autism so that you can help people with autism. He devoted himself at that point with helping his autism and became a prolific writer of books. He wrote a book about discovering that he had Asperger's. He wrote a book about bullying and Asperger's because that is an issue. He wrote a book about anxiety. And his best-selling book, which I do not have presented there, had to do with depression and Asperger's. And that became a very kind of big seller. and he became a national speaker and a wonderful speaker. He would speak in front of groups with 500 people all over the country. And that clearly came to a halt. Before I tell you a little bit about that experience and what I've learned from it and what I'd like you to learn from my experience, you not to have to go through it, is to have some discussion about the criminal justice system. Now, this is within my domain because, as I said, I'm a lawyer. I've been a lawyer for many years, practiced law, taught law, and always recognized that our criminal justice system is not as perfect as we would like it to be. Some say it's the best in the world. Well, I don't know about that. I never knew it as a customer of it. I knew it as a lawyer of it. It's a different perspective. But I can tell you just some facts that are worth noting, that there are approximately 2.3 million people incarcerated in jails and prisons in the United States. That's more than any other country in the world. In 1970, there were 300,000. So you can see from 1970 to the current number, it has increased sevenfold, in part because during that period of time, politicians have made law and order a popular political goal. And in doing so, it was good for the political arguments to be made of putting people in prison for long periods of time and putting more people in prison. So the prison population dramatically increased. We have more people in prisons in our country than China has in their country, even though they have 5 times the population of the United States. 75% of criminal cases involve people who are indigent, which means that under the Constitution, they are entitled to have a lawyer appointed to represent them. The fact reflects that most people who are charged with crimes, certainly most people, are people who can't afford lawyers and are people of modest means or people who are at the bottom of the economic levels of our society. Often, if you historically view criminal law, you will see that at various times in our country, there are certain groups of people who are viewed as people who need to be controlled by government. And one way to control people is through the criminal justice system. So we can go back to the 1950s, and we know that Japanese Americans were put in camps during, or I should say, during the 40s as a result of the war against Japan and the fear that Japanese citizens in the United States could create problems. So the criminal system actually interred them. In the 1960s, there were African Americans who demanded their civil rights. Later in the 80s, there was this war against drugs, which played out certainly against the interests of African Americans. And I can certainly go back before the 1960s and say that Jim Crow laws and the legal establishment were very harsh toward Black citizens in our country. In the 1980s, it began as the era of sex offenders, and laws from the 80s through the present time have viewed sex offenders without really designating the type of offense made. So it could be a rather simple non-contact offense to a horrible rapist, that in all one class they were seen as monsters and were controlled by increasing penalties within the criminal justice system and establishing the only type of crime that has a registry so that the public is easily aware of these individuals. So whereas a murderer who gets out of prison doesn't have to be on a public registry, all sex offenders, whether dangerous or not, are viewed as these monsters that have to be on a public sex offender registry. I'll talk a bit about the role of prosecutors. This is something, because I teach prosecutors, that their function isn't merely to get guilty pleas. That certainly is a function, and they need to abide by all of the ethical rules for lawyers, but they also have to seek justice. Justice does not always mean getting a conviction. Prosecutors have wide discretion when seeking justice. October the 6th, 2010, the day that, as I got a call from the FBI away to my law school indicating that I was under a search warrant for illegal images on his computer. He was just at the beginning of what looked like a very successful, to a great extent, mitigating lifelong issues that he had been dealing with as a result of his developmental disability. During this period, we immediately got certainly a lawyer to represent him. The next day, he was in federal court, and life changed immediately. And this is where you lose control. After the arraignment, while he still had the presumption of innocence, he was now on a curfew where he could not leave the house for 12 hours every day. He had to wear an ankle tether, had to see regularly a pretrial officer who could also stop by our house at any time, and had to be in a therapy group. And these are therapy groups that are horrible for people who have developmental disabilities for many psychological reasons. I certainly had to take an active part along with his lawyer. I couldn't help it, being also a lawyer, in trying to ensure and protect him as best I could. The matter ensued over the next 27 months as I think as an issue of trying to maintain our sanity between me and my wife and my son. We started, because my son had a publisher and they understood this issue of people with developmental disabilities getting into the criminal justice system and the correlation due to the social issues, social sexual development, etc. They thought it would be a good idea for my son to write a book with two world-renowned experts in autism, discussing openly his experience and what happened and what he had gone through, and trying to shed light for other families to perhaps avoid this highly awful, cruel, and unpleasant experience. So this is the book that my son wrote during the time that his case was pending. Most people don't want any publicity. They hide. They don't talk to anyone, and it's understandable. You feel your own government has turned on you. I have to say, as a lawyer who has had his faith idealistically in our legal system, this was very hurtful to me on a personal level. But the book, written with Tony Atwood, who's world-renowned expert in Asperger's, and Isabel Hanaud, one of the world's only experts both in human sexuality and autism, and my son, who wrote it. I wrote a chapter in it from a legal perspective, and my wife wrote a chapter from the perspective of what this does to a family. Before I mention the book that I've just recently finished, let me tell you, during the proceedings, the attorneys for my son had the U.S. attorneys, the prosecutors, understand my son and the difficulties that he encountered in his development and in his life. And this was all, I mean, we had, needless to say, records going back from a very early age that substantiated everything. But you have to go to experts. So a big part of our work was finding experts to evaluate my son. And my attitude was, let's get the best experts that we can possibly get, who are beyond reproach. We ended up with the man who headed the Child Study Center at the Medical Center for Yale University, who was a world-renowned expert in autism, who evaluated my son. We had a local expert as a forensic expert who also devoted his private practice to diagnosing and treating people with Asperger's and autism, and my son's own therapist. They all agreed that my son should not be prosecuted, that in no way is he a criminal, that he shows no criminal ways in terms of propensities to hurt anyone, and that the prosecutors had the discretion to give him diversion, which means that you're on essentially probation for 18 months and then you have no record. And that's what they thought was justice. This goes back to my notion of justice, because the only other alternative would be to have a criminal record and be a registered sex offender, and he is someone who never would or has hurt anyone. And all of the testing and the evaluation showed that he never would. So the U.S. attorneys read this over, and they certainly had an understanding, but they wanted a conviction and would not go along with the recommendations. They decided to send him, based upon the request of my son's lawyers, to get an evaluation by someone who they were going to retain. And they ended up retaining an FBI neuropsychologist in the J. Edgar Hoover building in Washington, D.C. So my son flew to Washington, D.C., spent a day with an FBI agent who was a neuropsychologist and who had gone through the entire file, my son's life history. I was really impressed with the fact that he had it on his desk, and it was clear that he understood, at least had read through it. My son spent the day. We left Washington. We waited for another 3 or 4 months without hearing anything. Finally, my son's lawyers called us, and he said, well, there's good news in that this particular FBI agent agrees with everything that your expert said and thought diversion was appropriate. But the U.S. attorneys would not go along with it. Again, my son's lawyers, who I think did an excellent job, argued more and took it up to the actual U.S. attorney in our district. And it really became her decision. She decided for another evaluation. She sent him to another well-known, nationally known forensic psychologist who spent a whole day with him, gave him all kinds of tests. And his end conclusion was, don't do anything that would further the development of this individual. He's gone through enough suffering in his life, and he's trying his best to, get over this particular life experience. Again, we were, I think, highly optimistic and only disappointed when the U.S. attorney would not go along with it and required a conviction, as is often, which is usually true in the federal system. Gave him probation, which they saw as the, as the big giveaway for them, because they normally send people to prison for many years. And of course, he would have to register as a sex offender, even though now he can be viewed in their eyes as a monster in society, even though he's never hurt anyone and his only goal in life was to help people. So that is the reason for the book that I then wrote with many other experts caught in the web of the criminal justice system: autism, developmental disabilities, and sex offenses. And this has chapters written by lawyers, written by the head of sex clinics at major universities, experts in autism, people who are criminologists who understand that in fact the type of crime that statistically has the least amount of recidivism is sex crimes. And that goes against the understanding of society. People don't realize that, especially in my son's case, just the objective recidivism rate for his crime of the illegal images on his computer for someone with a developmental disability is probably under 1%. And I think now even some recent cases have seen that the sex offender registry is really, I don't want to use the word hoax, but it really does not accomplish what the public believes it does. And a lot of that is also covered in my book, Caught in the Web. So I want to just conclude by getting into now advice. My hopes that you will never have to go through this experience if you are not already doing so. I think the first is recognizing your child as a sexual human being. Easy recognition that only opens the door to how to deal with that. Well, there you have to try to find professionals who can help your child understand, even though there may be this tremendous gap between the hormonal growth, which might be normal hormonal growth, may or may not be depending on the developmental disability, but it might be normal hormonal growth during adolescence, which makes one think about, consciously or otherwise, sexual activity. But the gap between the social sexual development might be for someone considerably younger, and therefore there is this gap. And that's where often computers come in and get people into trouble. So you need a good person, a good therapist who understands this issue and can make sure your child understands in clear, specific, and repetitive terms. It has to be repeated, the do's and don'ts of expressing sexual interest on certainly a computer, in terms of possession of child pornography, being conned into sexual contact with minors, going into chat rooms that can create problems. I mean, there are so many minors that get into trouble in going to meet someone who they think is a minor, but it isn't. It's a law enforcement person who's going to arrest them on site. Any improper touching, any of that stuff has to be understood, and it has to be understood not simply you can't do this, but here's what happens to you if you do it. And then you run through kind of the story that I've given. What can happen in terms of getting a lawyer and, you know, being incarcerated and wearing monitors and not being able to go to school and not being able to be with friends, etc. You have to be very detailed. Very important to instruct your child not to talk to any police officer without politely asking to have a lawyer present, or at least being able to talk to a parent, and having your child understand that that's okay, because FBI agents, police officers are trained on taking advantage of people with developmental disabilities and not exposing them to lawyers or to parents, which was true in my son's case. And you know, in my son's case, they didn't record everything, so there were even some discrepancies on what they said he said from what he said he said, and he's a pretty honest person. You have to take precautions to get a computer expert to put in any necessary restraints on illegal images or any other prohibited information in the use of a computer. So there are people who have that expertise, and they know how to do it. And it may be difficult, but you have to do what's necessary to protect your child. If a lawyer is ever needed, make sure that the lawyer understands the developmental disability and how it correlates or relates to the charged crime. The truth of the matter is, and there's research on this, what my son was charged with, which is a very serious crime, from his perspective, he is not a person who has any deviant sexual impulses, and all of that was shown in his psychological profiling. That's why experts in the field call it counterfeit deviance. It looks to perhaps prosecutors as if it's deviant behavior, but it isn't. And you have to understand the developmental disability to appreciate that. So it's important that a lawyer either has that understanding or is willing to undertake it. You know, I go back to a song by Billy Joel, if you're familiar with Billy Joel, or performer, and he has a song called You're Only Human. And it's a long song, but I pulled out some. You're having a hard time and lately you don't feel so good. You're getting a bad reputation in your neighborhood. It's all right, it's all right. Sometimes that's what it takes. You're only human. You're allowed to make your share of mistakes. And then he kind of goes on. And that's, I think, a good way to look at life, unless you have a developmental disability and you are charged with, most often, a sex-related crime, and you possess counterfeit deviance. In that instance, the song You're Only Human and it's all right, simply, unfortunately, tragically, cruelly does not apply. So with that, I hope I haven't, I've said that there are things that I can talk about that I've worked on and that are mentioned in my book for law reform. And I guess that's the basis of what I want to present from you and what now I would like to hear from you.
Okay, I don't see any questions currently, but I wondered if you could talk a bit about diversion and what that means.
Diversion is an extremely important concept in the criminal justice system. It varies from state to state. In the federal system, there are only certain crimes that the U.S. Attorney can give diversion for. One of those crimes had to do with the crime that my son was charged with, the possession of the illegal images. So diversion is permissible. And the purpose of diversion is, again, in seeking justice. Not everyone who commits a crime should go to prison. Not everyone who commits a crime should have a criminal record or be on the sex offender registry, because there sometimes are circumstances and ways of resolving a situation where there can be justice without those kinds of severe consequences to an individual charged with the crime. So it fits within the function of a prosecutor whose primary ethical obligation is to seek justice. You know, as I teach to prosecutors from our rules of ethics, and there are rules written down, prosecutors are referred to as ministers of justice. They oftentimes don't act as ministers of justice. What they do is they kind of put a blinder behind that function that they're there to serve, and they go to the other function, which is to serve as an advocate to get a conviction. Why is that good? It's good because it gives them a lot of wins. It helps them within their offices to be viewed as good, effective prosecutors who then get promotions and ultimately can get appointments as judges or run for political office. If you look at the people who make up our legislatures and states and Congress and the judiciary, you'll see that those who are lawyers tend most often to be former prosecutors, not defense lawyers. So you tend to get more of a kind of a law and order perspective in general. But But again, ethically, what is expected of these individuals is more of this balance between justice and being an advocate. So diversion is really the function of being able to seek justice without getting a conviction where it is appropriate. And in the federal system, what could have been done, what all of the experts recommended, was that essentially you go into a program with pretrial services, which are kind of probation officers that you have prior to a conviction, and they simply just monitor you for 18 months. And at the end of 18 months, assuming that there has not been any issue that has been problematic, you are then permitted to live your life as if you were never brought into the criminal justice system. There are variations of that in various states. Some are in mental health courts. So you have to kind of check your state or work out something with individual prosecutors who, can design a program for it. So there's a lot of variance on the state level. But I know that those lawyers who really have expertise in representing people with developmental disabilities and can establish that that correlation between the developmental disability and the charged crime with expert testimony. So you also need good expert testimony where you educate the prosecutor and you show that this is someone who is not a danger. This is counterfeit deviance. And you want judges and prosecutors to understand that. And occasionally some do, not U.S. attorneys for the most part, but some state prosecutors. That's the optimum way to go because people with developmental disabilities and their families have gone through enough difficulties and recognize the fact that when you lose control over a child, it is extremely painful. I can tell you that one of the things that I learned from the book that my son wrote, where I had a chapter in that book, I received a call from many families with children with developmental disabilities, probably over the course of a couple of years, maybe 60 families or so with very similar circumstances. And they were all lost. They didn't know what to do. They didn't know what kind of lawyer to get. They didn't know the amount of fear that they experienced was tremendous. My son could not function in a college dorm for 2 weeks. How would he have functioned if he was sent to prison? And I've seen a number of the families that I have talked to and tried to help in whatever way that I can have their children with developmental disabilities actually go to prison. And it's horrible. It's cruel. And, without the person being dangerous, as was true with my son, it in no way benefits society. So that's what diversion can do. Diversion really diverts one from the criminal justice system, recognizing that they're really not criminals, that they're not, that they didn't understand what they were doing. Now, the optimum thing to do is to make sure that your children are well versed on these dangers. I, as was true with most of the parents that I've had contact with, were blindsided. But was it natural to have sexuality as a special interest? Absolutely. Do I blame my son for having that as a special interest? I do not. There was a gap between his development sexually, his physiological development, and his social sexual development. So I'm aware of that. And I'm aware of the fact that the legal system viewed it entirely with lenses that in no way accurately saw who my son was, even though their own experts attempted to translate that to them. They're conditioned. Prosecutors are conditioned to getting convictions. So it gave me a kind of a new view in this particular area of criminal law. It's a very difficult situation to deal with. I mean, I have great sympathy for any family that has to go through it as a result of a child with a developmental disability. And that's why really over the last 8 years, I've devoted so much of my time talking to people. I don't represent them because that's not how I can best help them, but I will help them in any other way with their understanding of what they can do that, under the circumstances will be best for their loved one.
I have a related question that someone gave me. Are there any ways to force courts into recognizing someone may have a developmental disability and to meet their ADA rights?
That's a very good question. The ADA laws seem that you would think that there would be some application that a defense lawyer would be able to use those in helping a prosecutor to recognize the disability and somehow be mandated to take that into account. That is not the way it works. Some prosecutors, and I've seen many cases where prosecutors actually, when they see a developmental disability, they hold it against the person. They see that as a person who won't be able to control themselves or didn't understand what they were doing, and therefore the lack of understanding makes them more dangerous. The ADA laws can come into play, I think, more in terms of the way they'll be treated by, if they're a witness, if they're a witness to a crime, or if they're brought into court as a witness, or maybe if they're just arrested, you could maybe have the ADA accommodation law be known to them, which could help law enforcement treat them more humanely. But once they're charged, if they're actually charged, then the ADA laws, I do not see as having any real bearing on the kind of treatment that they will get.
I have a similar sort of question. Are there any special programs or standards that courts have to follow if someone has a diagnosis of a developmental disability or ASD?
To my knowledge, no, across the board. But there are certain states that are starting to recognize that people with, I'm aware of the autism population because I think there seems to be, according to some research, a number of people that usually are on the former people with Asperger's, who are referred to as high-functioning autism, are vulnerable to sex-related crimes, to things on the internet that relate to the internet, whether it be illegal images, whether it be going into chat rooms and sending pictures, or going out and meeting someone. And I in all of these situations, a prosecutor can see this as, oh, this is really serious. This is really deviant behavior. This is someone who is going to really hurt someone. There are also some cases where the innocence of these children are taken advantage of by others, and they're put in compromising circumstances. Where they're told, someone with a developmental disability is told, why don't you pull your pants down and show your private part to this little girl over here, and they're kind of coerced into doing it, and then the parent calls the police, and that person ends up being on the sex offender registry with a conviction for the next 30 years. I mean, this is common. So in some states, there is the recognition that the police need to be more sensitive to dealing with people and to understand autism so that they don't misread a cue of someone who has autism who has a meltdown and shoot that person thinking that they're dangerous or, you know, treating them harshly. And there are people who are told to wear a chain, you know, that indicates that they have a developmental disability. So the police would be aware of it. So there are programs in various states, depending on the state, and depending, oftentimes started by a parent who's gone through this experience as a result of their child. I think that's what you find, mainly the parents who've had children go through the criminal justice system and have lived through it often become the advocates of these kinds of programs. And then some police departments and some local prosecutors will take an interest, at least to help them in dealing with these people. That's a good thing. I mean, but I can't say it's being done across the board.
Another question. Are there any educational videos that walk adolescents and young adults through legal violations and potential consequences? Are you aware of any?
There is this woman in Montreal who was one of the authors of my son's book. And you can see her name. It's Isabel Hanault, Henault. And she probably has more along those lines of materials because she is so far advanced in this area that we had her at Oakland University, which is a state university right outside of the Detroit area. And they have a pretty good population of students with developmental disabilities, primarily autism, maybe 60 to 80 students. And we put on a program similar to what I talked about, but with a number of experts dealing with autism and sexuality in the criminal justice system. And she was one of the speakers. And she just literally blew everyone out of there. I mean, she is so far ahead of anything in this country in terms of her clinic, in terms of materials that she has developed, in terms of how she deals with people with developmental disabilities during their sexual development years, during their adolescence, and how she works with them in dealing with their sexuality. And I mean, it's something that there was such an interest in this program that the university thought they'd probably get maybe 30, 40 people showing up. And they ended up with 250 people who signed up. They had to cut off the list. There was such an interest. And she was above and beyond anyone else. So it may be worth contacting her if anyone really had an interest. Isabel Hanault. She writes a chapter in my son's book, but she devotes herself to this subject, and I think has done more than anyone else that I'm aware of in the world.
I have several people who have asked questions about how Nick is doing.
Well, I appreciate that, and thank you for asking. It was a nightmarish experience. I think that he totally, emotionally, psychologically is genuinely hurt at a very deep human level by being publicly put out there as some kind of sexual deviant monster. That causes him great pain. But on the other hand, I have to say that over these last many years, coming from being just almost a puddle of a person, being destroyed, these are charges that causes people with or without a developmental disability oftentimes to commit suicide. You know, it really breaks down the family. It breaks down the lifestyle financially. I mean, you are put in a position of having to hire lawyers. Yes, you can get court-appointed lawyers, but experts, if you have the money, it can eat up savings. I've seen families whose retirements were totally taken away from them due to wanting to spend that money as wisely as they could in defending their child. So considering where he has started from to the fact that he has now become an advocate, he wrote in my most recent book that I showed, he wrote a chapter. Nick is a great writer. He's a great speaker. He's a great communicator. And one of the things that he can do is he can express himself as someone on the autism spectrum. So he can translate for us who are not on the spectrum or have a developmental disability, what it's like. That's what he was able to do with his books prior to getting involved in this system. But he's been able to do that. He wrote, I thought, the most profound chapter in my book on what it's like for him to be a registered sex offender. So for him to do that, for him to gain some distance from what he has gone through by his ability to communicate and speak to groups. He's going to be speaking next month in New York to an autism group on Long Island with probably the lawyer in the United States who has handled more of these cases than anyone else, who's really deemed as the expert lawyer in these cases, and an expert psychologist who's testified in these cases. And he's going to be speaking there. So I'm amazed at how resilient he is in spite of the pain that it still causes him, considering where he started from, you know, at the origin of this horrible experience.
Has he been able to work since then?
Well, other than, you know, that's a good question. And this is, I think, requires to some extent an explanation of if you get a criminal conviction. I think there are those who feel, well, you should be entitled to rehabilitation, and you know, and in some states you don't even have to indicate that you have a criminal conviction if you're filling out an application for employment to help people in their rehabilitation. But if you're a registered sex offender, with or without a disability, it only places, for someone with a developmental disability, it superimposes upon them a second disability that may be even more so than their developmental disability. So it really almost takes away that as an option. But what Nick can do, and what he has done, not initially, this has taken years, is use his desire to want to help people, use his writing skills, because as I said, he's a wonderful writer, honest, and is willing to give you know, an understanding to his disability, and he's a great speaker, and I think he is still able to engage on those levels and be a speaker and go around the country. He and I spoke in Los Angeles. We have at other. He's just started to do this. So in the last couple of years, there have been a number of speaking engagements and writing, and we're working. This is a worldwide issue, so we're working with people in England now in writing a chapter for a journal. Nick and I and this professor at a university in Manchester, England, and we're going to be doing a webinar for them. Nick is going to be speaking with me on that. So he's getting back into that part of his prior life and his desire to help people. And it really, to me, and obviously I'm speaking as a father, it's such a waste of resources to not maximize what he was able to do and what made it so difficult based upon prosecutors' decisions that went against the good judgment of even their experts.
All right. Well, I want to thank you very much. I think our challenge now is to see if there is some way that we can put together an educational program to help prevent families from going through this. Perhaps along with exercises, including role playing for, our younger members to help them, keep out of the grips of the criminal justice system. So thank you
I
very
think that's a good idea. I would mention there is a woman by the name of Carol Gray, who
Yes.
has, if you're familiar with her.
Yes. Social stories.
Yeah, Nick's first book was published with Carol Gray, but she is someone who's done a lot of those kinds of stories, and Isabel Hano would be worthwhile to contact because I think she also would be helpful on making it very concrete, and therapists who can also work with children and deal with their innate and inherent sexuality.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yes. Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you for all the attendees as well.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Bye-bye. Okay.